Hey, everybody. It is Tuesday, August 6th, National Root Beer Float Day, Jill. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
Will you be indulging in a root beer float, Mosh?
Jill, I haven't had a root beer float in a very long time. If I can find a moment in my day to find a place that A, serves root beer, or we have vanilla ice cream and root beer and make a float at home. Alex is behind the scenes here saying, we could do root beer floats today. Anyway, FYI, if you're in the mood. I feel like it's one of those things like Cracker Jacks, like you had in your youth at some point and you haven't tried in a while.
Well, if Alex could bring, like a healthier, more natural version of the root beer float to your house, let us know how it goes.
I'm sure we're not drinking A&W root beer. We're going to drink a more natural root beer if we do. By the way, Jill, I totally messed up the intro. Who are you again?
Oh, did I? And I didn't notice. How's that?
No, there you go.
Okay, guys, I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news, read between the lines so you don't have to, and potentially engage in root beer floats on this August 6th.
And potentially get to some news here. So here are the headlines. And per usual this summer, lots of stuff going on. The Dow has its worst day in nearly 2 years. What's behind the stock sell-off and concerns about the economy? A judge rules that Google is a monopoly in a major decision that could impose new limits on the tech company and potentially require it to sell off some parts. The Veep's Veep, we will know today, and depending on when you're listening, we might already know who she chose. But for now, what's going into the decision and what comes next? RFK Jr. and the dead bear cub, Moshe. This is a story that is so bizarre.
We can't even get to the headline.
I can't even get through it. And people cannot get enough of it. What we know about this bizarre and strange tale in a bizarre and strange election season. Like, this is actually the weirdest things have happened in a very crazy election.
Are you sure? Because, Jill, as we were joking on the Instagram account yesterday, the headline writers, the writers' room for the 2024 election, they've really outdone themselves. Just in the last 6 weeks, we had the disastrous debate. We had a president pulling out after pressure from his own party, a cameo by George Clooney, an assassination attempt, the vice president taking over, RFK admitting to brain worms. Now we have RFK admitting to leaving a dead bear cub with a bicycle in Central Park. Anyway, we're going to get into all of this, the latest in election weirdness, Jill, with 90 days to go.
Moshe oversees why the Prime Minister of Bangladesh has resigned and fled the country. Back here in the U.S., we're also continuing to track Hurricane Debby, which has become deadly for several Floridians, what we know about its potential impact across the southeast United States and the East Coast. And the latest in the gender controversy when it comes to women's boxing at the Olympics, with the Algerian boxer at the center of it, is saying now. And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, your clue today, and I will note that some people did get that clue yesterday about the OC. The clue today, revved up like a deuce, another runner in the night. Revved up like the deuce, another runner in
Here's
the
my
night.
question for you. Are you talking about the Bruce Springsteen original or the cover?
Jill, we're going to get to that in Honest Day in History, but you're on it.
All right, all eyes are on Wall Street after a historic sell-off here in the United States and across the world yesterday. Global markets slid Monday as fears of a slowing U.S. economy were among the issues sparking investor concern. It was the most intense volatility that Wall Street's seen in years. Investors were rattled by a slew of disappointing economic data, including last week's jobs report, which saw the U.S. unemployment rate tick up slightly to 4.3%. Investors are worried it is a sign of a potential recession and that the U.S. Federal Reserve has waited just too long to lower interest rates and has choked the economy. One analyst explained Monday that it is a, quote, threefold fear. You've got poor manufacturing data that could mean a slowdown of the economy, the weaker than expected jobs numbers, and the Fed that won't cut rates until their September meeting, which they say feels like an eternity from now. The Dow is down just over 1,000 points or 2.5%. The S&P 500 index lost 3%. And the NASDAQ, which features many of the big tech names, well, they lost more, about 3.5%. When it comes to tech names like NVIDIA, we've told you about that chip maker. There is a large concern there when it comes to tech, a belief that some of those companies are just overvalued after an incredible run the last couple of years, and that some of the hype around AI may just be hype, at least for now.
Yeah, Jill, we've been seeing tech take a beating for several weeks here in the prelude to the sell-off yesterday. So a lot of factors here.
The Wall Street turbulence followed unease in overseas trading that sent Japan's benchmark Nikkei index to its biggest single-day drop on record. In Japan, part of the issue has to do with us, and some is specific to Japan, where there is concern about the currency and huge debt. Separately, cryptocurrencies also plunged, with Bitcoin moving nearly 11% lower. Still, even with the recent losses, which go back a few weeks now, the three major U.S. stock indices are still positive for the year.
Yeah, net for 2024, the S&P, as of this morning, is still up 9%. NASDAQ still up 8%. Dow Jones, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, is still up 3% on the year. And as I shared on Instagram, I wanted to give folks context because you tend to see these headlines, you tend to freak out. I was getting messages yesterday on Instagram being like, oh my God, do I have to sell off all my stocks? And I was like, well, if that's your view, anytime there's any sort of volatility on Wall Street, you probably shouldn't be in the stock market. Net, the market goes up over time. The average over the last 10 years has been a 12% return annually. Since 2008, only 2 years have finished down. In the past few years, Jill, in 2019, the market was up 31.5%. In 2020, with all that volatility around COVID, it was still up 18.5%. In 2021, the market was up 28%, nearly 29%. 2022 was a down year. It was down 18%. But then in 2023, it was back up again, 26%. So do you get the trend here? Effectively, you typically finish more green than red. So you need to hold. And depending on where you're at, you have a different mix. I'm not a financial advisor, but you want a mix depending on your age, depending on your retirement is, between bonds, between stocks, between how risky you want to be. So everyone just take a deep breath.
Right. And there are some analysts who would say that when the markets fall, it's actually an opportunity to buy.
Yes.
Instead of sell. Again, please don't take stock advice from the Mo News podcast.
The Mo News podcast said buy NVIDIA immediately. No, we're not saying that.
But it's just an idea. But it's just to reiterate this idea of don't panic.
Yeah, we heard from some people in the Mo News community, some financial professionals being like, yay, everything's going on sale, because the feeling is that the stocks have been overvalued. They've gotten the prices have gotten so insane. Nobody quite knew what to buy anymore after this ride that we've been on for a couple of years now. Now, as you said, there's a lot of underlying issues here. There's an issue of overall interest rates, the top line of the economy, right? Unemployment rate, the Fed, the central bank that has raised interest rates over the last couple of years to try to get inflation under control. What does that do? It dries up cash. It means that people have less money to spend, which means prices come down. Well, what does that do in turn? Well, it dries up cash in the economy, which then could hamper the economy and lead to a recession. That's the fear now, that they raised interest rates, kept them high too long to fight inflation, but did it so long that it hampered the economy and potentially could cause a recession here. So there is this rate cut that's expected in September. How significant will it be? We don't know. The issue with the Fed is they have one tool. They have a hammer. And that hammer has to be used against screws, against nails, against all the issues in the economy. Their hammer is used against inflation. Their hammer is used against a recession. But they have one tool here, and it's effectively interest rates, right? And so ultimately, yes, they have other stuff, but that's their main tool. And that's the point here, is that they have this one tool, and they got to try to control the economy with it. Some are already saying that yesterday's sell-off is an overreaction. That ultimately, the labor market is going to be normalizing here. This was shock and awe. The Japanese had some of their own issues, which is what led to that huge sell-off. And what happens with the markets, folks, is Asia goes first because of their timing, right? So Asia sells off. Then Europe freaks out. What's going on in Asia? Let's sell off. Then we open after Europe. We sell off. And there you go. Jill, with that frenzy, yesterday we did hear from a number of people in the Mo News community who invest through Charles Schwab, through Fidelity, through Vanguard. Apparently there were some outages in the online brokerages. So people were trying to access, trying to sell, trying to buy, and they couldn't access. Some of those accounts went down. Some apologies there. I imagine they have to figure out their systems to handle that sort of volatility, the number of people that were involved in trading. We'll see how it goes today. And then there's the politics at play here. You certainly could see this play a role in the campaign cycle, depending on how long this goes, whether things stabilize, how much of a correction we see. I should note that Biden's been trying to take credit for the economy. And so you've had Harris taking credit for the stock market. At the same time, Trump has been trying to take credit for the stock market until now, saying it's all about excitement for him being elected. That's why it's so up. And then at the same time, yesterday, Trump said, oh, it went down. It's totally Kamala's crash. He started labeling it Kamala's crash. And so that's what he was saying yesterday. He also did an interview, Trump did, blaming the stock market correction on illegal immigration. He didn't really provide evidence for any of these assertions, but certainly you're going to see here politics at play here. The folks at the White House note that the stock market is up 40 to 45% during Biden's presidency, much more than it was during Trump's presidency. There's going to be a lot of back and forth there. We should tell you here on this podcast, presidents have very little control over Wall Street. The traders are going to do what they're going to do. They're going to watch overall macro trends. Certainly politics plays a role in that. But ultimately, there's a lot of factors here. And who's winning in November played a very minor role in what happened yesterday.
And Moshe, one thing I want to mention is that depending on what happens in the next few days in terms of the stock market, and if the sell-off continues, there are some investors who are calling on the Fed to do an emergency rate cut, meaning to cut rates before their meeting in September. They technically can do that, but really that only happens in very, very extenuating circumstances. So it would not be the norm. But you could see already that there's kind of like this panic that's starting to maybe set in.
Yeah, and that's the issue, right? The Fed is trying to be the adult in the room here. And so they schedule an emergency meeting that could indicate that they're worried, which then has an effect of worrying Wall Street again. So they have to be very careful in how they do this, how long they wait. They had the same criticism that they waited too long to raise interest rates when inflation was an issue. Now they have the criticism that they're waiting too long to lower interest rates. But if they then lower them so drastically and so quickly, that'll be an admission that something is messed up in the economy, which then leads to people selling off, anyway. So a panic is an issue. We've seen it play out with Silicon Valley Bank and the various issues through the years that people, oh, wait, what are you doing? You're getting out of the bank? I got to get out of the bank too. And so you see how panic can have a real financial impact. And that's why the Fed has a big challenge ahead in the coming days and weeks.
All right, sticking with business news, a huge court decision that could have an impact on one of the largest tech companies in the world. A federal judge on Monday ruled that Google's search engine has been illegally exploiting its dominance to squash competition and stifle innovation. It is a once-in-a-generation antitrust ruling that could at some point lead to Google having to sell off parts of its company. The U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta wrote, quote, after having carefully considered and weighed the witness testimony and evidence, the court reaches the following conclusion. Google is a monopolist, and it has acted as one to maintain its monopoly. In a 277-page ruling, he said that Google's dominance in the search market is evidence of its monopoly. He says Google enjoys an 89.2% share of the market for general search services, which increases to 94.9% on mobile devices. So this represents a major setback for Google and its parent Alphabet, which plans to appeal the ruling. The companies argue that its popularity stems from how good the product is and consumers loving Google for search. Google's search engine currently processes an estimated 8.5 billion queries per day worldwide, nearly doubling its daily volume from 12 years ago.
Jill, to put in simple terms, it's like the Monopoly board, right? Owning Park Place and Boardwalk, blocking everybody out. Obviously there's oversimplification here, but ultimately Google has become so big that no one can even compete with Google. And that was the argument here in what was a multi-year case. The prosecutors here depicting Google as a giant because it was the prosecutors here depicting Google as a giant, a technological bully that methodically thwarted competition to protect the search engine and create a mega giant tech company that brings in about $240 billion in revenue annually. The Justice Department arguing that Google's monopoly enabled it to charge advertisers artificially high prices while also enjoying the luxury of not having to invest more time, more money into improving the quality of a search engine. See, when you're a monopoly, you don't have to do much. And so they argue in this case that because they're so big and there was no real competition, that hurt consumers. They didn't have to innovate the search engine. The evidence here, as far as the judge is concerned, the judge says showed the importance of default settings. He noted multiple examples, including that Microsoft's Bing search engine has an 80% share on the Microsoft Edge browser. So that shows how much search engines can be successful if they're the predetermined default option, like Google is on the iPhone and other devices. This has been a long time in coming. As I said, this lawsuit actually started during the Trump presidency. The Justice Department then filed a lawsuit 4 years ago when he was still president. It escalated over time. Biden took it over. So now you see the result of all of that. So what's next? The conclusion here is that Google has been running an illegal monopoly. That sets up another legal process. As you mentioned, Google and its parent company Alphabet are going to appeal here. So that could take some time. When that's all settled and say the monopoly ruling stands, then they got to determine changes or penalties that Google has to pay to reverse the damage that's been caused here. Eventually, the outcome could require Google to dismantle parts of its empire, sell off certain parts. That's unclear. Do they have to start a fund to help innovation and create potential competitors? Do they have to stop becoming the default option on iPhone and other places? How will the government and the judge here determine how to better level the playing field? And that's something that we've already said this is a 4-year process. This doesn't finish for at least, a couple more years.
Time for the speed read from CBS News. Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign is expected to officially announce her running mate sometime this morning, followed by a campaign video that will be released before their Philadelphia rally the same day. A video, Moshe. Can't wait.
It's how they do it these days. Online, they know that's how people are consuming their content.
In fact, depending on when you are listening to this, the news might already be out. So if that is the case, be sure to be on the Mo News Instagram account for all of the latest details. As she made her final decision between several governors, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Harris is said to have looked for a governing partner who has the experience to step into the job and be effective immediately and who's qualified to be president. Her team adding that the VP pick will share Harris's values of fighting for the middle class, protecting democracy and freedom, treating people with respect and dignity, and creating an America where everybody gets a fair shot.
Yeah, so we'll be tracking this throughout the day. Harris and the new running mate, we're going to go with governor. We're going to make a prediction here. Governor, it's going to be a governor, will make their first live joint appearance this evening in Philadelphia. That's the key battleground state of Pennsylvania. The entire election could hinge on Pennsylvania and its 19 electoral votes. It'll be one of the 7 states that Harris and the running mate will be visiting throughout the week. So look for their big rollout here. This will be a big deal, a lot of media attention. Also look out for how Donald Trump looks to fight back and bring media attention back to him over the coming days. Notably, Trump has tried to impact the process here. He did an interview with Fox over the weekend, and where he argued that if Harris picks Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, quote, she loses her little Palestinian base. So he's attacking her from the right. At the same time, Shapiro, who we should note is Jewish, has faced intense pushback from the left, from progressives, for his views on Israel, despite the fact that his views are pretty similar to Harris's views, or pretty similar to the other VP candidates' views. The one distinguishing factor here, he has the same opinions, but he happens to be Jewish, which has led to allegations of anti-Semitism playing out within the Democratic Party. That's why left-wingers are against him. They claim he's too moderate. They've brought up an opinion piece he wrote in college in the early 90s, where he said that Palestinians are too battle-minded to have peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Keep in mind, he was 20 years old at the time. It was the early 90s before the peace accord. He, speaking to reporters this week, he said, hey, I wrote that 30 years ago. A lot has changed since then. I do believe in a 2-state solution. I've learned a lot since I was 20 years old. That said, that was said as evidence from the left as to why she shouldn't pick him. Again, we might know by now, depending on when you're listening to this, whether she picked him or not, but certainly a lot of politics being played out here, a lot of constituencies, various members, leaders in the Democratic Party that tried to push her one way or another.
I'm glad you mentioned the pushback against Shapiro, because a lot of it started before that opinion piece came to light. And there were a lot of critics who said about these progressive groups, exactly to your point, that Shapiro's views on Israel are basically exactly the same as all of the other
including
candidates.
Kamala Harris, yes.
Including Kamala Harris. And in fact, he's been extremely critical of Benjamin Netanyahu. But what makes him different? He is Jewish. And I have to say, I've spent a lot of time in the comments section, as I often do.
Jill, avoid the comments.
Regret.
Avoid the comments.
Moshe, very good advice as always from you. But some of the comments on some of the posts, on some of the accounts that I follow that are more progressive, have definitely teetered, I think, into an area that probably crosses the line.
Yeah, I think you're being polite there. It's the comments. It's a nasty place, the comments, folks. By the way, we try our best, for those of you who ask on Instagram, to try to clean up the comments. It's very hard. So at some points, I've tried to block the comments. Then I allowed the comments. Just know that we don't have enough staff to curate all the comments. But if you see something egregious, please direct message me on the Instagram account and let me know if somebody's causing trouble over there.
By the way, I don't mean the comments on the Mo News Instagram account.
Oh, I mean the comments on the Mo News Instagram account.
I know you do. Yeah. I know you do. I actually follow a ton of accounts on the left, on the right, from all various things get a bit political uglier. Views. Yeah. And I read, and not only do I read the posts, but I read a lot of the comments on those. And that's what I'm referring to.
Well, a good place to turn to today is our Instagram account. As we mentioned, I'll bring you all the Veep news over there. We'll go live on our premium Instagram account later today when we have a decision. We'll break it down for you all over on Mo News Premium Instagram. If you haven't joined already, what are you waiting for? The website is mo.news/free trial. Mo.news/free trial. It gets you 2 free weeks of Mo News Premium. Check it out. Analysis, weekend news, quizzes, behind the scenes content, a lot of good stuff over there. The premium pod. Premium. It's where it's at this campaign cycle. Mo.news/free trial.
Sticking with politics, though, this is one of the weirder stories of the cycle.
or the weirdest. Yes.
Just can't make this up. This is from the New Yorker. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. confessed on Sunday that he had left a dead bear cub in Central Park in Manhattan in 2014 because he thought it would be, quote, amusing. Kennedy posted a video detailing this bizarre story on social media, apparently trying to get ahead of this article in the New Yorker that was set to reveal the story. In the video, Kennedy appears to be seated in a kitchen as he casually tells actress Roseanne Barr about it, which is like another weird layer.
Right, it's another Mad Libs here. Like, name a comedian who hasn't been heard from in 30 years. Yeah.
So he says he had a full day of falconry. Yes, that's hunting falcons in upstate New York. And that he'd come across a young dead bear cub on the side of the road. This was a decade ago. And here is a bit of his explanation about what happened.
So I pulled over and I picked up the bear and put him in the back of my van because I was going to skin the bear, and it was very good condition, and I was going to put the meat in my refrigerator. And you can do that in New York State. You can get a bear tag for a roadkill bear. I had to go right to the city because there was a dinner at Peter Luger's Steakhouse. And at the end of the dinner, it went late, and I realized I couldn't go home. I had to go to the airport. And the bear was in my car, and I didn't want to leave the bear in the car. I wasn't drinking, of course, but people were drinking with me who thought this was a good idea. And I said, I had an old bike in my car that somebody had asked me to get rid of it. I said, let's go put the bear in Central Park, and we'll make it look like he got hit by a bike.
So if you got that, he didn't have time to skin and eat the bear because he had a flight to catch, and he was going to have a steak dinner
at Peter Luger's in Brooklyn. Yes.
So instead, he decides that he's going to dump the bear in Central Park with an old bicycle to make it look like it had been hit by the bike. I don't know, bike versus bear. I give it to the. It
was a 45-pound bear. It was a bear cub. But yeah, apparently at the time they just introduced bike lanes. So it's his idea, along with his drunk friends. He says he was sober at the time, to say, let's concoct the story that make it look like the bear cub got hit by a bike.
Kennedy, by the way, was 60 years old at the time.
Right, this wasn't
a college prank. And he says that he was worried when officials started to investigate the crime scene because, quote, his prints were all over the bike. Roseanne Barr is listening closely to the story. She's laughing. She's looking shocked. She also has bleach blonde hair, which I haven't seen her have before. Kennedy tells her that fact checkers from the New Yorker had asked him about the story, and that it is going to be a bad story.
Yeah, and the story came out on Monday. It's not a good story for him. So he put out this video. Jill, who knows how many takes that he had in explaining this story or how they edited it. We should note that if you were in New York in 2014, you might have heard the story. It caused quite a stir, made a lot of headlines. In fact, was written up in the New York Times, ironically, coincidentally, by his cousin. Caroline Candy's daughter was writing for the New York Times at the time, unbeknownst to her. Her relative had dumped the bear cub there. He was driving.
It was crazy Uncle.
Crazy Uncle Bobby did this. It turns out 10 years later, the NYPD investigated this. They never came to a conclusion. They just said somebody dumped a bear here. We're not going to get to the bottom of it. He happened to have an old bike in his car. He's doing falconry. He's eating at Peter Luger's. Local New Yorkers will say, "Wait, you have a flight to catch, but then you're driving across the bridge into Manhattan to Central Park as opposed to
with a dead bear."
With a dead bear into Manhattan, as opposed to, I don't know, dumping it somewhere in Queens near the airport that you allegedly have to get to. There's just, Jill, there's so many questions here. Like, you're staging a dead bear and said, why are you going all the way to Central Park for the bear? Like, you could go into Queens. Anyway, forget it. We're getting too local here. The point is this: he dumps the bear with the bike. A woman's walking her dog. She finds it in Central Park. It becomes this huge commotion in local news. Bobby Kennedy Jr. spends the next 10 years not telling anyone that it was him. The cub at the time, by the way, they did an investigation. They found that it had been hit by a car. It turns out the New Yorker has a photo of him posing with a dead bear. They published the photo. And he, again, he's looking like a college kid doing a prank, like putting his hand in the bear's mouth. And you're like, bro, you're 60. Anyway, so the investigation comes to a close. They never figured it out. Now he's admitted to it. There is a state law that includes an offense on the illegal possession of a bear without a tag or a permit, and the illegal disposal of a bear. The fine is $250, but the statute of limitations has passed. So it's unclear whether Kennedy will face any sort of punishment for this. He apparently was asked about this by the New Yorker. Part of his comment to the New Yorker was, maybe that's where I got my brain worm. If you're not familiar with this, we told you about this last month. He's admitted to the fact that a brain worm was discovered in his brain that lived for several years. and then it died in his brain. He still has a dead worm in his brain. Kennedy admitted to this last month. So he thinks that maybe the dead bear is the reason he has the brain worm. Anyway, this is all real. This is the thing about Kennedy. Some people commented, like, hey, maybe you should consider being like other politicians and lie about some of this stuff. Because he's admitted to that. He's admitted to being friendly with Jeffrey Epstein. He's admitted in a more serious way to sexual abuse of a babysitter, saying, yeah, and I probably did that to other women too. I don't really remember. He admits to everything. And so, there's a lot happening here. They all feel very improbable. If you had a TV show about a presidential election, you'd sit there and be like, you can't do that plot. No one will believe that. And you're like, nope. We're going to do the thing where Kennedy killed a bear. And then he brought it to the steakhouse, and then he had a flight to catch. So he's going to dump it with a bicycle in Central Park. And his cousin is going to write up the story for the New York Times. And I haven't even mentioned yet, Jill, the story that came out a couple weeks ago where he was accused of barbecuing a dog. And he says, no, it wasn't a dog. It was a goat. Like, it doesn't end.
First of all, I would highly recommend that if people have not yet looked at your stories feed on Instagram of the actual reports from back in 2014 of witnesses who are horrified by seeing a
these poor people are walking their dog in like a nice part of New York City in Central Park, and they're like, there's a dead bear.
And he talks about that, how he was shocked that this was going to even be a big story. Like, oh, you thought that people were going to find a dead bear in Central Park and no one was going to care? Okay.
There's a lot there, folks. There's a lot. Anyway, he's at about 2% of the polls right now. It hasn't been a good couple months for him. He was thinking about dropping out last month. He had that phone call with Trump. Who knows what comes of this campaign? But there you have it. That's the latest in RFK Jr.
Okay, switching gears, let's go overseas. From Reuters, Bangladesh's Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, resigned and fled the country on Monday after hundreds of people were killed in a crackdown on demonstrations. So this started as protests against job quotas, and then it swelled into a movement demanding for her to go. Jubilant crowds stormed unopposed into the opulent grounds of the presidential residence, carrying out looted furniture and televisions. One man was seen balancing a red velvet chair on his head. Another held an armful of vases. Protesters were seen climbing a statue of Hasina's father and then started to chisel away at the head with an axe. This all ends a 15-year second stint in power for Hasina. She's ruled for 20 of the last 30 years as leader of the political movement that was inherited from her father, who was assassinated along with most of his family in a coup back in 1975. Hasina had left the country for her own safety at the insistence of her family, according to her son.
Yeah, we should note, by the way, Bangladesh is not a small country. There's about 170 million people who live in that country. It has dealt with instability through the years. And that includes, of course, Sheikh Hasina, who's been running the country this go around for 15 years. And while they have had elections, there have been accusations of corruption there, authoritarianism. She tried, as she was fighting these protesters, to shut down the internet in the country. There was also some violence against protesters, several hundred killed over the last couple of weeks here. And so the student protesters started because they didn't like this quota system. They were giving a certain number of government jobs to the families of veterans from the 1971 War of Independence in the country. It favored allies of Hasina. She said that she would revise that, but too little, too late. The campaign to escalate things and overthrow her was on. And so now you've seen thousands injured, again, hundreds killed. Bangladesh, not so long ago, had one of the fastest growing economies in the world, but it has been plagued of late by slow economic growth, inflation, unemployment. She's now left the country. They're going to have to figure out an interim government here and look to stabilize the place.
From Fox Weather, at least 4 deaths are being attributed to Hurricane Debby as the now tropical storm continues to slowly move across the southeast after making landfall along Florida's Big Bend region early Monday morning. The Category 1 hurricane made landfall near the community of Steinhatchee around 7 a.m. Eastern time, with winds estimated to be at around 80 miles per hour. A combination of rain and flash flooding, damaging winds, and a life-threatening storm surge caused mass power outages, with more than 300,000 customers being knocked offline. The 4 people killed so far include 2 children. 3 died in traffic accidents related to the storm. 1 child died when a tree fell on a mobile home that he was in.
Yeah, if you were watching coverage yesterday, as I was, some of the reporters who were there at the scene described a hurricane, even though it was only Category 1, 80 miles per hour, as much more powerful than they thought it was going to be. And the big concern is not necessarily the winds, but the rain. That's the big issue right now for Georgia and the Carolinas specifically. The storm is expected to cause historic, if not catastrophic, flooding along Georgia's coast between Savannah and Charleston, South Carolina, especially 20 to 30 inches possible. Yes, that is 2 feet to 3 feet of rain, because this thing is going to just sit today, tomorrow, Thursday. States of emergencies have been declared in Florida, in Georgia, in South Carolina, as residents are still suffering from the consequences here. And then Debby won't be finished. The storm will slowly move its way up the East Coast, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, New York. Jill, you in Long Island, you could experience the effects of it this weekend, dumping lots of rain. So beware. And be looking at weather apps this weekend, especially if you're on the East Coast, because this thing still has a lot of power in it.
From AP News, Algerian Olympic boxer Iman Khalif, at the center of a gender controversy, said that the wave of scrutiny that she has faced, quote, harms human dignity, and called for an end to bullying athletes following the international backlash against her. She says, I sent a message to all of the people of the world to uphold the Olympic principles and the Olympic Charter, to refrain from bullying all athletes, because this has effects, massive effects. It can destroy people. It can kill people's thoughts, spirit, and mind. It can divide people. And because of that, I asked them to refrain from bullying. The victories of Khalif and fellow boxer Lin Yuting of Taiwan in the ring in Paris have become one of the biggest stories of the Games so far. Both women have clinched their first Olympic medals, even as they have faced online abuse based on unsubstantiated claims about their gender. Both had been disqualified by the Russian-led International Boxing Association from last year's Women's World Boxing Championships. The association alleged that the women failed to pass unspecified gender tests that found that they had male chromosomes, but only after they beat Russian boxers. They've never revealed what tests they conducted or any further details about them. An International Olympic Committee spokesperson said the 2 women have been women since birth. They have always competed as women. They are women on their passports. And except for the unclear, unverified tests that the IBA conducted, They have never been questioned, and he called the International Boxing Association's eligibility tests flawed and not legitimate.
Yeah, we first told you about this last week. More and more keeps coming out about the IBA, which has now been disqualified from the Olympics. There's a lot of boxing organizations here. So the IOC is taking control of at least boxing when it comes to the Olympics here. Khalif has previously called her 2023 disqualification a conspiracy against her, again saying that nothing came up until she beat a Russian, and then the organization, which is run by a Russian, suddenly said that, I am not a woman. She wants to tell the entire world, she says, that I am a female. It's actually led her family to speak out. She comes from a very rural part of Algeria. Her father did an interview with a station there and was showing the birth certificate, which shows that she was born a girl. He said, my child is a girl. She was raised a girl. She's a strong girl, and she is brave. Keep in mind, Algeria, a very conservative Islamic country where any questions about non-traditional gender, sexual preference, any of that would be punishable by prison time and potentially death here. So there are real-world consequences to all of this as this comes about. At the same time, we have the International Boxing Association coming out and having a news conference on Monday where they could answer some questions, but then they couldn't answer some questions. The AP called it shambolic. That was the description the reporter there used to describe the press conference. They saying they really wouldn't answer questions about these opaque eligibility tests. They wouldn't put out data. They're saying they can't put out data. The IBA can't because the IOC, the Olympic Committee, won't let them do it. But then they wouldn't really reveal what the testing was. Initially, they said last week there was no testosterone test. Now they do say there was a testosterone test, but they can't reveal the testosterone test. Then they initially said there was a chromosome test that showed male chromosomes, and then they said there was no chromosome test. Now they said there was a chromosome test, but then they won't go into detail here. They appear to either be unable or unwilling to discuss the science, if there is any science behind what they're doing here. And we should note that the IBA here has an unprecedented banishment from the Olympics after troubled governance, and among other issues, one of the reasons they've been banned, the International Boxing Association, is because of a lack of transparency in how they do what they do. So a lot of questions here. At the same time, these two boxers, Lin and Khalif, are both in the bronze medal round. They're both fighting today because of the way boxing works. You actually, fourth place also gets a bronze in boxing. It's unique to boxing there at the Olympics. So both are guaranteed bronze medals. And if they both win their bouts, they could face each other in the gold medal match on Friday. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1945 on this day. We're at the end of World War II here. A B-29 superfortress, the Enola Gay, drops the atomic bomb named Little Boy over Hiroshima, Japan, resulting in an estimated 140,000 deaths. Tens of thousands of those deaths resulted in weeks, months, years later from wounds, radiation poisoning. 3 days later, the U.S. would drop another bomb, this one on Nagasaki, that would kill 40,000 more people. A few days after that, Japan would announce its surrender from World War II, effectively mark the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. On this day in 1962, after 300 years of British rule, Jamaica becomes an independent country. And on this day in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act into law, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. All right, and we end here with some pop culture. Jill, you got the answer to your question there. Today's anniversary, Manfred Mann's Earth Band's Blinded by the Light, 48 years ago today.
As much as I love Bruce Springsteen, I do think that that's a better version of the song, even though it was a Bruce original.
It's a Bruce original. He writes it in 72. He releases it in 1973. 3 years later, Manfred Mann's Earth Band is the name of that band. They do their own version of it, and it actually goes to #1 on the Billboard charts, the Manfred Mann version, not the Bruce version. It's sort of like Whitney Houston and Dolly Parton and how I Will Always Love You, right? There's Dolly's version, which is Dolly's version. It's classic. But then there's Whitney's version, which is iconic. And I probably shouldn't be comparing Blinded by the Light to I Will Always Love You, but you get the point. And Jill, I can keep going with versions, right? Respect, R-E-S-P-C-T, Aretha Franklin. It was actually written previously by Otis Redding. She did a much better version of it. We could do a whole separate podcast on songs.
Who sung it better?
Who sung it better, and sometimes the second version or third version being better than the first. One song that we celebrate on this day in history from 1990 that was good the first time around, Garth Brooks' Friends in Low Places, comes out on this day 34 years ago.
I got friends in low places. Great song.
Speaking of versions and sequels, on this day in 2003, 21 years ago, Freaky Friday with Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis opens in theaters. We're awaiting to hear the new version, the sequel to the sequel, Jill, of Freaky Friday. That comes out next year. They've put together the cast again. But the original version of Freaky Friday is from the 1970s. That's with Jodie Foster and Barbara Harris. So there's Freaky Friday, the 1970s, Freaky Friday 2003, which is the anniversary today. And then next year, they're back again, where apparently there's another body swap in the newest version of Freaky Friday that's expected to come out sometime in 2025.
Okay, marking my calendar.
We'll head to the theaters to see Freaky Friday part whatever.
All right. Thank you guys for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. And in case we are still waiting for the VP pick, Moshe, I did do a very, very unofficial poll on my Instagram feed, Jill R. Wagner. And it looks like the people are with you. Most think that Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, will be the vice presidential pick. Others are with me, not as many, and think it's going to be Tim Walz. And then there are those that say that they think it's going to be Senator Kelly or perhaps someone else.
All right.
So we'll see.
This is the thing about the VP pick. Literally one person ends up deciding who that is, and she knows, and then she will tell that person, and then we will find that person out today. So we will be back with analysis of that pick, what it means, what it doesn't mean tomorrow.
All right. Bye, everyone.